Okay, so now that we got through with all that, we can get to our speakers. And Miss Ann Nielsen will be our first speaker. And she will be talking about PLUM Curculio biology and the management of it.
Okay, it's not showing up here as being full screen. Sorry about that. So I'm from Rutgers University in New Jersey. We're not quite the number 1 or 2 peach growing region in the country, but we're 3 or 4, depending on the year. So PLUM Curculio is one of our major pests in peaches as well as apples, but we'll only talk about peaches today. So we do get a lot of different beetle pests or beneficials in your orchard, but most of these are not as problematic as our good friend. Okay, wait, we're not advancing.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. Now we'll try this again. Okay, so we have lots of other different types of beetles in our orchard systems. Some of them are beneficial, like our lady beetles and our soldier beetles. We have Japanese beetles and some other weevil species that are not very friendly to our crops. But PLUM Curculio is a weevil, it's a native weevil pest throughout the United States, or at least most of the United States, and it is can be quite problematic. So it does have a pretty wide native range. So all of the states that are here in green it's part of its current range. The Rocky Mountains tend to segregate it out. In certain parts of the country, especially in the mid-Atlantic states, it is also a pest in blueberry crops, but that seems to be located more centralized to the mid-Atlantic states, partially due to its genetics likely. So PLUM Curculio causes 4 different types of injury. The adults will leave an egg scar, and that can deform the fruit and reduce its quality. And then, of course, we have the larval feeding inside of after that egg laying. If a fruit has a larvae inside of it, it can cause that fruit to drop. The tree will kind of excise that fruit, so you get direct damage from a fruit drop as well. And then you can also have larval contamination of that fruit at harvest. So we can get 4 different types of injury from PLUM Curculio, and overall that can cause around 60% of loss in an untreated orchard. We can get 100% loss in some of our research orchards. And because of that, it's the number 1 pest concern in New Jersey among our peach growers, and even with all of our other invasive species. And in general, based off of our surveys, it's pretty much routinely the 2nd most damaging pest or problematic pest in the Northeast, when you include cherries, apples, and peaches together. And a lot of this is because we really don't have, even though it's a native pest, it's a persistent problem in orchard systems. A lot of our IPM programs really just don't tackle this pest, and our IPM programs are pretty far behind. It has a 50 to 55 day life cycle, and activity can last about 5 to 7 weeks. When we have cooler springs, which we've been having these really kind of variable weather events, and it really alters our phenological predictions. But when we have cooler temperatures, it extends the period of activity for PLUM Curculio, which means that we have a longer period that we have to manage PLUM Curculio. It used to be that our growers would spray twice a year for PLUM Curculio right at the beginning of the season. Now we're up to 4 times a year at least. We have 2 generations per year in the mid-Atlantic states, and you guys down here have at least 2. It looks more like 3. So activity is highest at temperatures above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, but egg laying can occur anywhere above 50 degrees. So this is some data that I pulled from our research blocks in our untreated controls over a couple years in just various different trials that we've had, because what I was seeing when I started was that we had a lot more injury from PLUM Curculio. It was just constant. Every year we'd have injury from PLUM Curculio. And so I looked at the percent fruit injury, which is just, the number, if a fruit has any type of damage on it, it's injured, right? So that averages, before my time, 82 83%, now we're 71%. It's about the same. This is all from the same block, too, and it got pulled out in 2019, which is why that data stops there. But what is changing here is the severity of that injury, so the number of egg-laying scars that we have on that fruit. We can have up to 50 egg-laying scars on a single fruit if we're not controlling it. But you can see that this number jumps from about 1.4 to 6 1/3 egg scars per fruit. So we're seeing an increase in injury, and I don't know what that is caused by. I don't know if it's climate. I don't know if it's that we've lost some of our more efficacious materials, and so our populations just overall are higher. But we are seeing increased injury in our peaches by Plum curculio, and our growers are also having increased injury, and they're having to do more sprays. So I mentioned that larval contamination is an issue. These pictures actually come from Brett Blau here, but we can see this as well. This is the larvae present in the fruit at harvest. So oddly enough, this fruit can look totally sound on the outside. As my son told me once, he bit into a peach and goes, "Oh, Mama, there's a Plum curculio larvae inside of it." And I said, "Oh, well, did you eat it?" But so that kind of injury is really problematic. You don't want your consumers to be biting into that peach and finding a live worm inside of it. So I mentioned earlier IPM for Plum curculio is a little bit far behind. When we think about IPM as a pyramid, which is how it's often referred to as, we have our least invasive tactics at the bottom, and then insecticides are always at the top. Well, for Plum curculio, we don't have a lot of options. There's a little bit of research on habitat management in terms of different ground covers you can use, but that has not been widely adopted. We do have trap tree approaches for Plum curculio using their aggregation pheromone to kind of create these artificial hotspots in the orchard. That works really well in apples. When we've trialed this in peaches, because it's an aggregation pheromone, it's bringing a lot of the bugs into a smaller area than they'd normally be, but into a very concentrated area. And so we end up really increasing the damage on a few trees, but it's to the point where it's not economically viable in peaches. It works more in apples than it does in peaches, just because of the value of the crop. So the next step is entomopathogenic nematodes, which I will talk about in a little bit, and then insecticide applications. So what I'm going to focus on is how we can kind of better integrate some of our IPM tools that are still invasive. We're still, insecticides are still our primary way of controlling Plum curculio, but can we do that in a better way? So we have traps for Plum curculio, but they're these, the tedder trap or our black pyramid trap, and then we have circle traps. These will intercept bugs as they're kind of walking through the orchard and maybe flying. These intercept the bugs as they walk up the tree. So that works really well if they're walking. It doesn't work very well if they're flying. If you bait them with an aggregation pheromone or some of the plant volatiles, you can obviously increase your trap numbers. But again, the attraction to the trap, whether it's without an attractant or with an attractant, decreases once there's fruit on the tree. Once you have that fruit on the tree, those traps are not as attractive as the actual fruit itself. So they're good at detecting movement into the orchard, but not necessarily prolonged activity. We've done some work on degree day timing, that it is a better indicator of PC timing, PC activity than just plant phenology, like shuck split or petal fall, but it's also complicated. So we do have 2 degree day models, a southern one for the southern generation and a northern generation in apples. There's these 2 populations of Plum curculio are genetically different, but we actually use the southern generation model in New Jersey, even though we're up north, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about where Plum curculio is in the orchard, when to manage it, and how to manage it. So for sampling, we used limb jarring or beet sampling, unbaited traps, and the circle traps. And we did this weekly from bloom through harvest in New Jersey, West Virginia, and Georgia. So I'm only going to show you the data from peaches, because that's what we're talking about. So if you look at, and this is hard to see because it was put together by a postdoc with much better eyes than I do, but the red here is the edge of the orchard, and these are all 5-acre blocks. The blue is the interior of the orchard. And in New Jersey, what you can see here is that we see a really strong peak in the edge of the orchard early in the season. Okay, that's what we would expect. This is an edge-driven species. They're coming in from overwintering sites outside of the orchard, immigrating in, and then they move around. But now in Georgia, there's no edge effect here. There's no difference between the edge of the orchard and the interior of the orchard throughout the season. And it's not significantly different at all. So there's no edge effect in Georgia, which means that they're probably overwintering inside the orchard more so than outside of the orchard. In places where we have a wood edge, we see a strong association with that wood edge in terms of the number of PC that we catch is strongly associated with the distance from the edge. And we see that in 2019. It's a little less strong in 2020 and 2021, but it is still significant. So what we wanted to look at was, we know we have an edge effect, but how are the PC actually moving throughout the orchard? And so what we did is we used protein marking, where we spray egg whites in the area here that's in yellow. So we're spraying egg whites from the tractor onto the peaches. It doesn't smell that great. And then we spray the inside with milk, which smells worse if it's hot. But the idea here is that if there's any bugs in the trees already, they'll get marked. If there's bugs moving into the orchard, by walking over the leaves and the treated material, they'll self-mark. Then we can collect them, and in the lab, we assay them for the protein itself with an ELISA. So what we can see here is that 75% of our bugs on the exterior of the orchard were marked with the egg protein. That makes sense, right? But 75% of them are stopping on the edge. However, 65 of them are also marked with edge on the interior. So we're seeing an edge effect, but they are moving in really fast. And then in the interior, we still have 55% of the bugs that are marked with milk alone. But then what you have to look at is how many are marked with both. So we have about 46% of our PC that we collect on the inside of the orchard that are marked with both egg and milk, which means that they are moving from the edge to the interior of the orchard. So these PC are really moving back and forth. With some of our other insects, like brown marmorated stink bug, when we've done this similar type of work, we see this edge effect persist for 14 days. We're not seeing that happen with PLUM curculio in New Jersey, even though we have that strong edge effect. So it looks promising when you look at it this way, but the fact that they're moving significantly throughout the orchard kind of decreases our confidence in being able to use border-driven tactics. So when to control PLUM curculio, we've been working for years on trying to refine a degree day model for PLUM curculio. Degree day models are kind of our core in IPM tactics to better predict the timing of PLUM curculio. But because PLUM curculio is occurring really early in the springtime, they're occurring in the orchard right after bloom. And what happens almost every year, in New Jersey at least, we get really early blooms, and then we get really cold weather, and we get a spring freeze. So half the time we didn't have fruit, which is a whole other issue. But it makes trying to use these degree day predictions pretty tricky, because we know the bugs are there, but they're not necessarily moving and behaving in the way that we would normally be able to predict them with a degree day model. Degree day models are really useful for our moth pests, but they're not, it's falling apart with PLUM curculio. We do know that we can use, we do get our first trap catch in about 200 degree days, base 50, starting at January 1. So for us, that's the beginning of May. For you, is that March? It's pretty early, yeah, March, okay. Our first egg laying is about 100 degree days after that. So as soon as they move into that orchard, they're mating and they're laying eggs pretty fast. We see our peak egg laying around 400 degree days, and then the peak trap of our second generation is 1,500 degree days. So we only have 2 generations per year. If you have more, you'd have to add on to that. So if we were trying to manage based off of degree days, we've traditionally always used petal fall and shuck split in peaches, and those timings align pretty well with oriental fruit moth, which is another key pest for us. If you're under mating disruption for oriental fruit moth, Actara is a good material to use. Otherwise, your first application should be an adulticide because they're not laying eggs quite yet. So you want to use an adulticide to kill the adults before they lay eggs. And this would be Imidan, Avant, Asana, XRL, or Vertiprin. And those applications should continue on about a 7 to 14-day schedule depending on the pressure. Now, the peak egg laying occurs around 390 degree days, so you can use a material that also kills the eggs. So Actara and Belay are going to not only kill the adults, they'll also kill that egg so it doesn't become a larvae. You'll still get an egg scar on the fruit, but you won't have that live larval contamination at harvest. In second generation, you're going to have to time that with other pests that are in the orchard, and Avant, Imidan, and Asana are good options. So we've broken this up to, for my growers, I've broken this up into kind of the different insecticide classes and the different life stage to target. Now, unfortunately, most of these are pyrethroids. The problem with using pyrethroids early on in the season is that you can flare mites and scales later on in the season because you're killing. The pyrethroids are broad spectrum, and so they can be harmful to the natural enemies of things like scales. And San Jose scale is becoming a bigger problem in New Jersey, and I know it's a major problem here. So the adulticides are Imidan, Actara, but Actara is also going to get your eggs. If you have brown marmorated stink bug, Actara is a good material for that too, so you need to kind of take into consideration late season management for that. Belay is another neonic that's going to get the adults and the eggs. And then for just the adults, you have Avant, Asana, Warrior, and Baythroid. And Ryman in apples you can use for the eggs, and I think it's labeled in most places for this for the eggs as well, for peaches as well. So can we take all this information? We know that insecticides are our primary tool for managing plum curculio, but can we spray better? So we've done a lot of work in my lab with border sprays for control of other pests, and so we wanted to see if that would work for plum curculio as well. So we know that we have a strong edge effect if the bugs are walking. We know it doesn't persist as long as our border sprays, that border effect for other insects, because we have a lot of movement by the adults. So we did some initial trials in 2019 that weren't that promising, but we did not do a full block spray first. We just did 3 border sprays, and the way I define a border is just by looking at this. So it's the edge of the trees, the trees that are on the edge, and the first full row. So you just go around the orchard, with one side on, and then you go up the first full row with both sides. So when we compared this to our grower standard, and this was done at a research farm where we have a lot of pressure, we're still getting pretty high damage. But our border spray was significantly different than our control, but it was also significantly different than our standard, which was sprayed every week. But we did see a significant reduction in the number of egg scars per fruit. So we thought it'd be worth trying out in a broader scale. So what we did is we compared on research farms throughout in Georgia, West Virginia, and New Jersey. We compared it to an untreated control because we know that the grower standard is somewhat effective. We did a full block spray starting at 200 degree days, and then weekly border sprays until 730 degree days, which was about 4 applications. And then we compared that to a border spray plus a nematode application. The nematode application is timed to control the larvae that are in the ground. So when the larvae are in the fruit, right after, when the fruit are still pretty small, they will leave that fruit, or the fruit will drop to the ground, and the larvae will exit, and they'll spend their last larval instar and pupate in that ground. And that gives a really good timing to control them with entomopathogenic nematodes. So we applied border sprays plus nematodes. Now the entomopathogenic nematodes, these are beneficial organisms. We used Nemesis R, which is a BASF product. It's Steinernema rio brave. They will seek out the larvae in the ground. They'll reproduce inside of that. You get a few more larvae. You get a few more infective juveniles or nematodes, and you can repeat the cycle over again. Timing's pretty important because you need to make sure the larvae are present in the soil, and you need to have good conditions. Less UV degradation, and you want good soil moisture. So we did this with a weed boom sprayer. And you can see it coming through the orchard. Sorry, it's a very weedy orchard. It's a research orchard. But if you can see it, there is nematodes coming out of the spray of the weed boom, and we're just applying it right underneath the drip line of the trees. So it's just regular tank agitation. It basically comes as a block. It looks like a sponge or tofu or something like that. It's not very appetizing. I just mix it in, take it out to the orchard. So when we did our first generation damage, this is mid-season, right before pit hardening. Our border spray and nematode treatments were not significantly different from each other, but they were significantly different than the control. When we look at harvest, which is after the nematode treatment would have taken effect, we do see a significant reduction in the amount of injury in the border spray plus nematode versus the border spray alone and the untreated control. And these are Fantasia nectarines. The ones on the left are the ones in the untreated control plot, and then these are the ones with the border spray and nematode treatment. So you can see a little difference in the quality of that fruit at harvest. When we look at that by location in the orchard, we can also see that our border spray alone worked significantly different than our untreated controls. Most of our injury occurs at the edge, but we still have a pretty high injury in the middle of our orchards. And again, these are 5-acre blocks. And our border spray plus nematode treatment, we did have increased injury on the interior, but that's because we were not applying any insecticides to control PLUM curculio on the interior of those orchards. So we wanted to verify that the nematodes are actually doing what they say they are. So we have these cages. We put PLUM curculio larvae on there. This is part of our normal treatment. So they were sprayed with the weed boom sprayer. And the number of PLUM curculio larvae that emerged is significantly less than the number of PLUM curculio larvae that emerged in the border spray alone. And then both of those were significantly less than the untreated control. So the nematodes, especially this Nemesis R formulation, has the potential to control the larvae. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're getting multi-life stage control. So we're controlling the adults with our insecticide applications, and then we're preventing damage from the next generation by controlling the larvae. So it seems it's a little bit different approach to it because you're trying to prevent damage that hasn't occurred yet, and it's an investment in your orchard to do that. But we haven't run the economics of this yet, but I think that would be a good trade-off in terms of the economics to reduce the future damage there. So looking at data from Brett in terms of the activity of PLUM curculio in Georgia, again, he's divided this up by orchard edge and orchard interior. You have a nice clean 3 peaks here, which leads me to think that you definitely have 3 generations of PLUM curculio, at least in 2021. These numbers, this population at this site, it's actually much lower than our population pressure in New Jersey, so I'm a little jealous. Again, you don't see any edge effect here, but what I would recommend is doing border sprays or something that is reducing the amount of insecticide you're applying for that first generation, because that's the time where your natural enemies are going to be active and most sensitive to any insecticides. So anything you can do to avoid pyrethroids or just reduce the amount of insecticide, kind of that precision agriculture that you're talking about, where you can reduce the amount of insecticides applied to the orchard. Border spray might be a good tactic, even though you're going to have some injury on the interior. And then using insecticides plus nematodes against this second generation. So the insecticides would be against the adults, and then timing the nematode application against those the larvae of that second generation. You may be able to reduce some of this damage that is occurring from the third generation, even though that might be after you've harvested your peaches. But that could maybe reduce your injury overall, or at least your population pressure for next year. So how does PLUM curculio management fit into IPM? We're still trying to figure it out a little bit. If you have mating disruption for internal worms, it's going to help you. The movement We do have 75% of our adults, at least in New Jersey, that are stopping at the border edge before they move in. The peak activity is occurring between 290 and 730 degree days. Border sprays effectively controlled plum curculio adults, but I'm not sure if it's effective enough yet. I think we still need a lot more data to figure out if this is a tactic we could take out to our growers. But I think it's a good way to get started on thinking how we can, I think we should have flipped it around. I think we did a full block spray and then border sprays. I think we should have done border sprays and then full block sprays. Because I think that would have better matched up with the way PC moves. But the hope here is that we can reduce the amount of pyrethroids due to and reduce the impact to secondary pests like San Jose scale. And we have white peach scale up in New Jersey too. And then the addition of the nematodes can help to control the larvae as they enter the soil around that June drop time. So that has reduced our second generation feeding significantly over just using insecticides. So we know that border sprays have been working for other pests, and in a 5-acre block, you're only spraying about 25% of the orchard. So it can be a significant cost savings as well. So we've got a big crew, some of whom were involved in this. Brett was involved in some of this as well, and my former postdoc, Clementa Coates-Mensa, who's now at Lincoln University, was involved in this, as well as Robert McDougall and my technician, Ann Rucker. So with that, we post our information up on the Rutgers Plant Pest Advisory, but if I have time for questions, happy to take any. Anyone? Okay.
I've got one.
Yeah.
Brendan, your thoughts on it compared with other insecticides for plum?
So we tested it when it was under a different name. And it worked as well as Actara. And it also has the ovicidal activity. So I'm pretty sure. It's been a few years since we tested it. So for us, it worked really well. It also is effective against oriental fruit moth. So for us, that's a really good material because the timing for plum curculio lines up with oriental fruit moth. And our growers our growers are hesitant to use mating disruption because, well, we have to control plum curculio anyways. So trying to make that selection for the different insecticides based off of all the pests that we have to manage is tricky. But that one, when it was under a different name, worked really well for OFM and plum curculio for us. So, yeah.
And what kind of damage is the fruit going to do?
At what kind of timing?
Yeah.
So for us, we call it June drop. So it's when the fruit's about yay big and still really green before pit hardening. And it's usually the second week in June-ish. It depends a little bit on the year that we're having, but that June drop, it's called June drop because it occurs in June. So, but we've tried to quantify how much of that is due to plum curculio, and it's because I think our harvest data actually doesn't fully represent all the injury that we see, because we do have a lot of that fruit drop from plum curculio. So, all right. Is that where you want this?
Yep, that's
Okay.
good. All right. All right, thank you. Oh, wait, we have a gift for you.
No, I think did I leave my hard drive? No, I have it. Okay.
Do you have yours? Okay. All right.
Oh, thank
There you go. All righty, thank you.